Hello everyone, this is the third episode of the VICTA Parent Voice, the parent-specific podcast. In this episode, we're touching on a really important topic, and we're going to be looking at, the feelings that we get as parent carers when we receive the diagnosis, why it matters so much, and why it becomes like one of these really important days in our lives. I can remember my diagnosis story like it was yesterday, and I know everyone's is very individual to them. But, in working with parents now for over a decade, when we meet in face-to-face events or on online workshops, diagnosis stories seem to be ones that people really want to share. And then when we invite guest bloggers onto the VICTA Parents website, people come and write and share their stories. They're always very keen to talk about the diagnosis. And, it's a moment that we do remember forever, and it's something that changes our life forever. And we just put on this trajectory, and all kinds of things happen along this journey. And I think it's good for us all to be here today to discuss it. So I am joined by Karen Howkins, who is a parent. And we're also going to be joined by Paula Thomas, who acts as the ECLO at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And we're also joined by Mark Chapman, who is an RNIB ECLO. I'm going to hand over to Karen, who's going to tell us a little bit about herself and her daughter and, how her diagnosis story is affecting her or did affect her at the time.
Thank you, Charlotte. So hi, everyone. I'm Karen Howkins, and I have got a 6-year-old daughter called Holly who has a diagnosis of nystagmus, ocular albinism, and a kind of very rare disorder called Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome type 5. So we've been on quite a journey with Holly since she was born. She was born in March 2020, so it was just before the first COVID lockdown. And all throughout my pregnancy, had quite a straightforward, happy pregnancy. Was kind of pregnant at a similar time as 2 of my best friends and my sister-in-law. So I was kind of really excited and pictured, what my life was going to look like. And Holly was my firstborn and my only child as well. So when she was born, everything, again, was quite straightforward. It was a fairly long labour, about 3 days in total. And she was born really healthy. But kind of a few hours after being born, her breathing went quite strained. And one of the doctors kind of had a quick look at her and realised that she wasn't very well. And she was rushed into intensive care over at Northampton General Hospital and then later Leicester Royal Infirmary with sepsis. So we spent kind of the first couple of weeks of Holly's life, obviously quite poorly, and receiving a lot of care. And then just as we were discharged from hospital, we entered the first COVID lockdown. So it was kind of really strange to go from kind of so much support around us, lots of, clinicians and doctors and so forth, to kind of nothing for those first few weeks and kind of no visits from family and friends or health visitors or anything like that. So, but in some ways it kind of helped. We just went into our little bubble and enjoyed life as a family. And, kind of didn't, like I said, Holly was my first, so I didn't really know that anything was different. And it was only kind of when things opened up a little bit in lockdown, kind of about 4 or 5 months in, and family would start visiting, but kind of realised that something was a little bit different with Holly. So, for example, it was if you remember, we had quite a fantastic summer. So it was very bright and sunny outside, and kind of noticed as soon as she went outside, she was really upset and couldn't quite handle being in the sun and had to come in. And it was actually my mother-in-law that first kind of broached the subject and said, I don't think Holly's fixing very well when I look at her, and encouraged me to bring a health visitor at that time. So the health visitor kind of reluctantly at that time came out because there wasn't visits, had a little peek of her in her Moses basket asleep and kind of said, yes, she looks fine to me. I wouldn't worry about it. And kind of naively back then took that as a really positive sign of, everything's absolutely fine, nothing to worry about. And then a few weeks went by, and my mother-in-law, she's really kind of in tune with that kind of stuff. And she worked at doctor's surgery. So we're really fortunate that, she actually took a video of Holly eyes wobbling as they were. Again, kind of didn't realise that wasn't normal, and showed it to a doctor in the surgery and just asked for their opinion, to which they turned around and confirmed, yes, it looks like she has something called nystagmus. So unfortunately, it was kind of up to my mother-in-law in a way to broached the news to us of that diagnosis. And, it's kind of devastating at the time. So I was relying a lot on Google to research it, and obviously just read that this would mean that she would be blind, and, kind of not really understanding what that meant. And, we were quickly able to see her paediatrician after that. And then that led on to referral to Great Ormond Street Hospital with her ophthalmologist, that did confirm that, yes, that she had nystagmus and ocular albinism. And, really kind of grateful for Dr. Bowman at Great Ormond Street, because he also picked up that he felt that she had something rare, kind of highlighting that, kind of talked to us a lot about chromosomes, which kind of went over my head at the time, but highlighting that many females don't tend to just have the ocular albinism. They tend to have albinism of hair and skin, which Holly didn't appear at that time to have. So he referred us for some genetic testing. And then kind of about 12 months after that genetic test, we discovered that Holly had a condition called Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome type 5. So that is Holly's cause of albinism. It's her cause of nystagmus. But in addition to that, it also causes a blood platelet disorder. So it means that Holly's blood platelets don't function in quite the way that they should, which causes easy bleeding and bruising, which kind of made sense at the time. Because obviously, she was a little baby and was always kind of covered in bruises, and still is. So it's been kind of a lot to get our head round. And, kind of we received that diagnosis, but still other health conditions of Holly have, it's always kind of every year we find out something new. So Holly also got diagnosed with severe obstructive sleep apnea. So she was on a CPAP for quite some time. And she also last year was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder as well. Bless her, she's a little fighter and has been through an awful lot in her life at just kind of 6 years old, as of being a family, and still kind of, learning more and more about her condition all the time, and having to educate lots of consultants and hospital staff about Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome, because it's not widely known. But that was kind of our story to diagnosis, really.
I completely understand and echo what you say, because everyone thinks this diagnosis stage is you just told your child is blind, and it's as straightforward as that. But it is quite regular that other conditions keep creeping in, just as as your child begins to age. Like with Scarlett, her learning disability and autism didn't present until she was older. So I felt like we dealt with the vision loss side of it, and then a new diagnosis had come up. Then things are nice and steady now, especially when your children are quite little. You're thinking, what else is round the corner? What else can be thrown at me as a parent? And Karen, Holly is currently under GOSH, is that correct?
Yeah, so she's under kind of shared care between Great Ormond Street and our local hospital in Northampton, but we don't have an ophthalmologist currently in Northampton, so we're mainly in Great Ormond Street entirely for our care at the moment.
Fabulous. Well, that leads in quite nicely to our next guest, Paula. Paula is the current ECLO for Great Ormond Street. And although you tend to work with families more who are a little bit further down the line than the diagnosis days, I can imagine a lot of the things that we felt during that moment, you still see them presented in parents, as their child is getting older.
Yeah, hi, Charlotte. I think we see such a mixed group at different stages, and it's never an easy conversation to have. We tend to or I certainly tend to see parents when they're already kind of aware what the diagnosis is, but sort of come to us for a second opinion, or if anything can be done. Not always, but that's another kind of level, really. So there's lots of expectation when parents come to Great Ormond Street. And that's quite a responsibility, because you very much feel if you're getting the same answers that you were getting from your local hospitals, and then you've come to see us, is that you're hopeful as a family that we're going to say, no, they've got it all wrong, and we can do this and we can fix it. So we've got another level going on, I think. Of course, we also see like with Karen, is that we see children who are under us because there is no specialist within their area. So of course that is different. And I think for parents, one of the tricky things for an ECLO to kind of manage and handle is that I know that the one word that you hear is that we can't fix it and your child is blind and we're going to register. And even though there's probably lots of other conversation going on at the time, on that first visit, that's what you remember. And that's what you take away as a family. And of course, it's a difficult one to get your head around. And I think as well, when there's lots of other diagnoses as part of that, visual impairment seems to be the one that parents struggle with the most. And I think because quite often there's a very practical element to other parts of a diagnosis. So it might be, the interventions, stomas or feeding tubes, or, there's other things that families can do that are very practical. Whereas the vision side of things, that kind of feeling as a parent that you can't do anything practical at that stage. And I suppose that's where we come in as ECLOs. I love the fact you introduced me as the current ECLO. I've been there 16 years, and I've done it for a while. It's definitely very current, but very ancient as well. So I've learned as I've gone along. ECLOs, we're fairly new. We're fairly new to the NHS, sort of around 2000. There was a pilot project, and it's not that there wasn't anything in place before, but it was very much a social services role rather than sort of stepping away from that. So ECLOs have grown and grown. And we're known as everything. So eye care liaison officers, I hear quite a lot. I've always been an eye clinic liaison officer, and I'm a little bit particular about it. But there's, family support workers, there's volunteers, there's groups of lots of other organisations that are in hospitals. So even if you don't get introduced to an ECLO, it's not to say that there isn't somebody within the hospital doing a very similar role. And how I describe the role is we're not medical. There's a reason we have consultants, and the reason they study very, very hard. And they're definitely the medical ones. As ECLOs, you have such a broad knowledge of all sorts. I have to look things up. Even after 16 years, I have to go and look things up. But I'm not expected to know the ins and outs of that. What I do and what other ECLOs do is I'm a very glorified signpost. So it's having lots of knowledge and being able to make appropriate referrals in a timely manner, because I can flood you all with everything instantly. And some parents want that. They're like, just chuck everything at me. I'm always a little bit reluctant to do that. So it's holding your hand through this, and at each stage where there's changes, making different suggestions. So we're a glorified signpost. We know a lot. We put you in touch with the relevant organisations and certainly let you know about them, because it's choice. And if you don't, I think that's really important. There's not one organisation over another that is going to be the one to go to. It's going to be a mix of lots of different things going on. It could be Facebook, it could be Instagram, it could be parents groups, it could be face-to-face stuff. Depends on you as a family. It depends on your dynamic and what you want. And so we kind of manage that ship and steer you, hopefully, in the right direction.
My own experience of coming to Great Ormond Street wasn't due to the vision, because it was pretty much clear cut, but I did come for the neuro development side of it. And when I did come, it was with a view to kind of fixing this. I felt like I was getting very limited answers with regards to some of Scarlett's behaviours, and obviously that was related to neurodiversity. And I think a lot of parents think, once we get to Great Ormond Street, things will be different, they'll have a different response. And I think I'm not alone in saying, with the parents that are listening today, everyone feels a little bit like we're told what we would consider one of the worst things that's ever happened to us in our lives, and then kind of sent off with a leaflet. And I think that's where the jobs that yourself and Mark do are, so pivotal, because beyond Google, which I don't always highly recommend parents access once we receive a diagnosis, you are the people that are in a position to do, and you're definitely not a glorified signpost. You offer so much more than that. It's the holistic side is so important at that time in life, and having someone to listen to. I'm going to bring Mark in here. Mark works for the RNIB. We would have all have heard of the RNIB and the wonderful work that you do. In terms of ECLO, you provide, you can give me the actual real life information about this, Mark, but you provide ECLOs on a national scale. You are the main organisation that provides these. Mark is very highly spoke of in the ECLO world, and provides lots of events and offers lots of support for families. And so this is why I asked him to join us today. Mark, we get these parents, they're told this information, they're trying to process it. What do you feel is kind of one of the most common journey? When do they go from a point like of how can I fix this to this is how it is and I'm going to embrace it?
I think it's different for every parent, every set of parents, every family member. A bit like in normal life, we all kind of come to acceptance through things when things change, be it like people talk about grief, and most people understand grief of loss, where you've lost somebody like a family member or a parent or a partner or a friend or whoever. And most people kind of have an understanding of that. For the adults that I talk to, they're mostly going through that as well because they've had good sight and lost it, or are losing it, and that can bring in those similar kind of emotions and things that you go through. But for parents, often, there is that kind of disbelief, and then the denial and worry about things before coming to acceptance. I think there's a lot of stages to go through. And people often talk about grief as a cycle or a stage. And I think you do zip around between being angry at someone or angry at yourself. Parents often want a kind of a definitive answer about what their child can see or can't see. And I think the younger the child is, the harder that is, really. I think, our specialist here has got so many years' experience. I think he does an amazing job by seeing a child or a baby even, and by looking at the back of their eye from scans they have, and then also seeing how the baby follows things or not. They have a good idea, but some of the conversations I have a lot with parents is about, we probably just don't know right now how things are going to be in a few years. And people don't often want to hear that because we kind of want to, get a diagnosis of anything. And you probably want a more definitive, this is how it is.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think I've written a blog many years ago about seeking a definitive, and that was actually from my visit to Great Ormond Street because it's kind of hung in midair and this waiting to see aspect. And when you're doing visual tests for young children who may not be responsive due to their age rather than their sight. And I kind of willed Scarlett to get to an age where she could talk, so she could confirm what she could and couldn't see, and we never got to that point.
Absolutely.
We just
Yeah.
settled on the fact that there was no visual responses, and there never has been any visual responses. So she's
Yeah.
one of the rare children who don't. But I completely understand the guilt side of it as well.
Yes.
Karen, do you have similar feelings? We as mums are in charge of our children when they're in our stomach for all their months, and we don't expect it, and it comes out of nowhere, and we as the carriers do harbour that guilt.
Absolutely. And, kind of exactly what Mark said as well. I think people understand grief when it's a loss of somebody, but perhaps don't understand the grief of the life that you've imagined versus the reality that you're now in. And I have, some comments that were made to me when we first discovered Holly's diagnosis, which I know were said with sympathy and with care, but where Holly had been so poorly when she was born, some comments have been made of, you nearly lost her, kind of be grateful that she's here. And I remember kind of really struggling with that kind of response and thinking, I should be grateful. We've gone through such a journey, and I did nearly lose her when she was born, but still I'm grieving that life that I was imagining. And, and I'd certainly resonate with what Mark was saying there in terms of some parents go into denial. And I think I was a bit like that in the beginning, particularly when your baby's so young. It's really kind of hard to see, and when they're your only child as well, to see the differences between her and other children. So when she was given that diagnosis at first, we were told originally that she met the criteria for being partially sighted. So I used to tell people, oh yes, she's got nystagmus, but actually her vision, it's only minor. And then I remember that day of going into Great Ormond Street when we were given that diagnosis of saying, well, actually, she meets the severely sight impaired criteria now. And that's what, we're going to recommend as her registration today. Just feeling absolutely devastated and shocked. And I think the reality hit me then, because we'd go to these appointments and they would do these checks, but I, was kind of in that denial stage thinking, oh, but, I don't see that. And I think, that kind of grief and that realization, you kind of get your head around it, but then something else will happen that gives you that stark reminder that she is different to other children. And, an example of that has been this weekend. We've been at a family wedding, and it's the first time I've taken Holly to that kind of environment. So I was really kind of nervous. It was, very overstimulating how she was going to be, and spent the day like watching my nephews and like other children really enjoying the day and playing and dancing, and kind of Holly just really couldn't cope with that. So even if you'd spoken to me a couple of weeks ago, I probably would have been more certain of, yes, I've got my head around the diagnosis, and I've accepted it. But then I had moments this weekend of just kind of really feeling that grief again of watching other children and seeing the struggles that she has compared to others. So it definitely is a journey. And even when you think that you're there and you're at that acceptance, something can just, kind of hit you all of a sudden.
I completely agree. Like, where I had a conversation with my teenage son, who is a year younger than Scarlett, and he said, "Mum, if you were to have another baby again," which I would never ever do,
Yeah.
I'm too old for starters, "would you have a boy or a girl if you could pick?" And I thought for a moment, and I didn't actually think too long, and I said, "I'd have a girl." And he said, "Oh, why wouldn't you want me to have a little brother?" And I just said, "I've actually missed out on so many like girly things that I would have been able to do with a child if she weren't complex needs, like the going shopping, she's not bothered about clothes, broken heart, she'll never be in a relationship. She's soon to turn 16. I still know that there is elements of life that I've missed if my daughter wouldn't have had complex needs. So it doesn't stop.
Absolutely.
Mm.
So Mark, back over to you. I know we've covered a lot of diagnosis stuff. You do spend a lot of time with parents who are going through so many, fighting for educational rights. They're starting to struggle socially. We're trying to get certain school placements. So, a lot of us parents are under like chronic stress, a lot of sleep deprivation. How do you, as an ECLO, help parents to manage that?
Well, that's a very big question. I think, as Paula said earlier, sorry, Paula, I've forgotten what word you used, but I used the word hub. So I feel like I'm a hub. So I try and know as much of everything as I possibly can. And again, as Paula said, I sometimes have to look things up or go, yeah, wait a minute, this came up 6 years ago or something, So I'm forever Googling or checking my own records for things. But so sometimes it's about knowing who's supposed to do something. A parent, and when you were just talking a minute ago about grief, it can be too early to talk about some things right in that first moment of diagnosis, and it takes a while. I'm very proud and pleased when people ring me back a few weeks later or 6 months or a year later and say, "Do you remember us? We spoke to you, da, da, da." And then they've got another question or something has come up because they're ready now. But often when people get in contact, they might say, "Oh, we're having trouble with this." And actually, there is an organisation or a council department or somebody that's supposed to be dealing with it. They're just not kind of doing it quick enough or well enough. And sometimes just having one of us helping along. Sometimes just having my either hospital email address, or I've got an NHS one, a hospital one, an RNIB email address. Sometimes just me dropping an email to someone. You'd think I was important because sometimes it just gets a response and then people get the help that they need. So sometimes it's not about what we have to do. It's about knowing, like on a simplistic kind of, I say simplistic, sometimes it can be a nightmare. A silly thing, again, like a blue badge applies under the wrong criteria, and the blue badge people just say, "No, you don't get a blue badge." Well, actually they do. They just didn't do the application quite right. So I can sometimes email whichever borough council's blue badge department and kind of explain what's happened, and things just kind of get sorted. So more often than not, it's about knowing who to contact rather than actually doing the thing ourselves, if that makes sense.
Which is important because it's not always very easy to understand and navigate.
No, exactly. When you go through it every week or every month or every kind of time that these kind of things go wrong, or someone is fighting for a school, as you said, a school place, or to get extra help. Or I might speak to people that have never had the QTVI kind of support or a sensory support, or have even heard of some of these kind of things, or spoke to someone yesterday that didn't know that most children are eligible for an echo device, like a echo Echo Show Kids. I've got it in the right order. Or maybe that there are grants available from certain things. So often we're led by somebody ringing up with an issue, or something's come up, and then we can suggest, oh, well, there's this, and this. And hopefully then sometimes people want to just do, so if I can explain to someone how to get a blue badge, I have a little bit of info that I can send out, how to do it yourself in the simplest way. And I can just email somebody that and say, this is the easiest way to do it. Or if someone needs help with things, because occasionally I'll speak to parents who are visually impaired themselves or have other things going on. Not everyone's amazing on the internet or with applications of things. Often there's local help or national help from the RNIB. Locally here to me, we have Sight Concern Bedfordshire, there's VICTA, there's other places that will help to do the applications.
We're already feeling overwhelmed because we're processing this life-changing news, and then things like a blue badge, which are really difficult to apply for as well. You know, it's not as straightforward as you imagine. And it was something as simple as just reducing the amount of pixels in an image and for it to be approved. And I just couldn't figure out how to do it. And we didn't get a blue badge for about 10 years because I thought, out of everything else I'm handling.
And occasionally, even after all this time, things come up, and something's occurred to me this week that hadn't really occurred to me before. So a parent rang up about their child. They were registered over 10 years ago, before my time in this hospital, and they hadn't had the chat about all these things that are available. So we had a little chat about it, and while we were talking, this child had ocular albinism, and I was talking about a friend of mine who works for the RNIB with albinism, and his whole kind of demeanour changed. It was almost like he hadn't thought that his child could be working. And the fact that I was talking about my friend with albinism, who's registered severely sight impaired and is doing an ECLO role, it seemed to be quite a lift for him. His whole kind of attitude and emotions seemed to kind of change, which was lovely to hear. And I hope that will kind of give them a bit more positive in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I
I'm
completely
laughing.
understand that. I wanna touch on now. For me, Scarlett was the first visually impaired person in our family, and I know there is a lot of hereditary conditions or an expectancy with some vision loss. When we are told our child is blind, that's the first time we've encountered him. We get so many people to VICTA events, and it's like the first time we've ever seen another visually impaired child. We do early years events, and that is always a big one because a lot of parents come there and that's the first time they've met a parent or seen another child. So I want to come over to you, Paula, because you are an ECLO and you are also visually impaired, and you may be perhaps the second visually impaired person that they see after a
Yeah,
child.
it's a huge responsibility. I do feel like here's one we made earlier, and they've kept me in the cupboard. It is a huge responsibility, and it's something does work in my favour for the majority of the time. Sometimes it doesn't, and actually very rarely. I can probably count on one or maybe two hands where actually a parent is not ready to be confronted with me. But I think it does work as a positive. And I always say no question's a silly question and you can ask me anything, because actually it's really important to do that. And, the fact that this wasn't a pity post, I worked hard to do what I'm doing, is that I am working, I have a family, I run a chaotic home, and I've got all of those things going on. I'm usually well presented, though you wouldn't want to see me today. But all of those things, it is a massive responsibility. And I work with some great consultants who love the shock factor things. They tell parents things that I've done. And I'm like, well, I wish you wouldn't tell people. She rides horses. She's a crazy woman. But that does get sort of thrown out there. And there's a place to do that, and there's a time to do that. I'm a cane user and a guide dog user, but in clinic, he's a bit of an old boy now, so he gets to lay under the desk. So I tend to leave the dog in the office. But yeah, most parents will know me. Even if they don't know me by name, they'll know me. The woman with the dog, they all know who I am. But it is a massive responsibility. But there's no, going back to sort of things that you've both yourself, Charlotte and Karen, have said, is there is no right way of doing things. There is no sort of set of rules to follow. You've talked and you've touched on grief, and I won't go sort of back to that. And we've kind of mentioned everybody's, in inverted commas, journey is different. And it's something that if anyone that knows me, they would have heard me say this, is that, your route from A to B, straight line to Manchester from London, quite a boring route, quite predictable. But when you've got a child with a disability, actually, you need to take diversions and you need to go off, down the scenic route a little bit. You still get from A to B. It takes you a bit longer, but crikey, you see a lot more on the way. And it's a funner journey. And it doesn't mean that you don't get from A to B. It doesn't mean that your child won't work, get married, leave home. Obviously, if there's more complex issues going on, but when we're talking just about visual impairment, the route is slightly chaotic. You have to fight a little bit harder to get down those side roads and those country roads to get to B, but you learn from your child. And I think parents really want to understand what their child sees. I'm 50. Actually, am I 50 or 51? Crikey, I'm 51. And still, my parents and my family still don't get it. And I'm good at explaining it. And I know what my limitations are. And I have to fight quite hard to say what I can do still at this age. I'm very sorry, Karen and Charlotte, because this never ends. As parents, you'll still have that very protective kind of feeling. You'll still want answers. You'll still be thinking that you need to battle, and even when your girls are grown and flown. So there isn't, I can't just tick a box for you. I can't say this is what's going to happen. I think we all do it as parents. I've got a crazy 18-year-old. Is when I was pregnant with her, you sort of think, she's going to be an astronaut, or she's going to come up with some life-saving surgery. You have all these plans. Believe me, none of our children turn out the way that we kind of had this little map going on for them. Part of that is disability, but not all of it. And they're never going to do what we tell them to do because they're children and they don't listen to their parents. So good luck. But yeah, and I kind of try and get that across. All of our children are different for lots of different reasons, and actually navigating those pathways. If I can ease that in any way, if I can start parents thinking in the right way from the beginning to be able to advocate for themselves and their children, taking that format, you then sort of feed into that going forward. So once you've got those building blocks in the right kind of order and you've got a sturdy foundation, if I can do that for a family, I will always help a family. Like Mark has said, not everybody's got capacity to do this. I also make sure, and I think most ECLOs do, we're all slightly different, but I have a very much an open door policy. You don't need an appointment with me. You email me in the middle of the night if you have to. I don't answer at that time. I do wait till the next day. But those questions don't come up at your yearly appointment, your 6-month, your 3-monthly appointments. They come up in the middle of the night. That's when you email me. That's when I get back to you. And I think if you can get that flow of conversation, because I hate it when any of my teens leave us into adult healthcare, it's awful because it's like, where have they gone? What's happened to them? So a lot of them do. I still have, I've got patients all over the world now, starting their own families and going off to university. It's very scary because I do realise how long I've been there. But that's actually really important. And I do still check in with them, or they check in with me, which is great because otherwise I have no idea what they've gone off to do. So they do let me know, which is great.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paula. As we're coming to the end now, so I'm going to start with Karen. Obviously, Holly's still quite young, so advice might be interchangeable. Or the answer that you give me now might change later down the line. But in terms of advice from the start, what would you feel has been the best piece of advice you've received?
That's a good question, Charlotte. And I think, kind of the best thing I've learned is to not compare Holly two other children and realised that, all the things that I worried about with Holly, early on, would she walk? Would she talk? Would she crawl? All these kind of questions. She has got there. And I think you can just drive yourself crazy, particularly in those early years of comparing her to other children. And actually, you have to see your child completely separate to that. And, what might be a small achievement to other people is a really big achievement for us. And another thing I've really learned along this process as well is to really trust your instinct. And that sounds really kind of cliche and, something that all parents would say, kind of trust your gut. The system sometimes doesn't support that. And I have, had appointments before where, I've been saying that I know something's different and kind of being told, well, no, that's normal. And this is what's to, be expected, kind of champion that within your inner self and, fighting for what in your heart and your gut is right. And the other thing is reaching out to other people. It can feel quite lonely, particularly if you're, like you said, Charlotte, it's the first person or that you've ever come across in your family or your inner circle that's got a visual impairment. So reaching out in either virtual groups or charities like yourself and meeting other parents has been a massive help for me. I am a different person now than I was kind of 7 years ago before I had Holly. And I'm really proud of the person that I am. And I'm really grateful for the friendships and the experiences I've had, kind of good and bad. I think feel that they've shaped me and they've shaped my family as to who we are. And so kind of reaching out to those other people that have got similar experiences and journey to you is really important.
And thanks, Karen. And if you'd like to hear more from Karen, she's been our wonderful guest blogger for the month of May on the VICTA Parents website. So I will link her blog into the description area of whatever streaming device you're listening to this podcast on. I'm going to hand over to Paula. Paula, you can answer this however you like. It can be either advice that you were given, or you could, something that your mum did for you when you were a child that you want to pass, impart to other parents, or something that you would deliver in your professional capacity.
I can't believe you've been brave enough to give me free rein on that.
There we go.
Because we could go anywhere, couldn't we? I mean, touching on everything you've said, and the support one's an interesting one because I always describe that as a seesaw. And yes, there needs to be a balance. Over supporting is as bad as not supporting at all. And you can apply that to life at home and school and hobbies and all sorts. So mine is always, well, actually, you could never tell me no. If you told me I couldn't do something, I was going to go and do it anyway. So I think, make things work. If your child has a burning desire to rock climb or skydive or race cars around a track, all of which I've done, ride horses, all of those things, it's making it work. So say yes to stuff. Peer support, hugely important. In actual fact, thank goodness for the internet, because the peer support for families, my parents never had that. I was diagnosed at Great Ormond Street. You didn't really you didn't meet other parents even in the waiting room, because actually at the time, pediatric ophthalmology back in the 70s, mid-70s, just wasn't a thing. So watching that change for parents, it's why I do my job, is that wasn't there. The choice wasn't there. I go back to that choice word. You didn't have a choice about school, where your child was educated, you were told. And for me, it's ensuring that every step families have choice, and don't try and stop your child from doing stuff they want to do. And like Mark has said, I'm more than happy, because there's such a network of ECLOs, and we're all pretty good. We might be employed by RNIB, or as with me, direct through the hospital or through another organisation. But we do know about each other. So I encourage anybody, if you need an ECLO or similar, you're listening to this, even if you've never, you're Great Ormond Street, but our paths haven't crossed, I kind of have to rely on the consultants to flag. I don't see all of you. There's hundreds a day, so apologies. But all you have to do is email me, and it doesn't matter if you've not had an introduction via the consultant. I'm now going to be flooded with emails, but it's fine. But you don't need an appointment. Just email me.
Okay,
Yeah.
amazing. I want to thank you all for giving up your time this morning to come and chat. You've all shared so wonderfully, and it's been very insightful, I imagine, for parents who haven't encountered an ECLO and will perhaps going away and finding out if there is a service offered in that area, and for the very kind offers from you both to be contacted by parents. And also a huge thank you to you, Karen, given that Holly is still quite young. It's very brave of you to come on and talk very candidly about your experience and share in a fabulous blog, which will once again be linked in the comments. So yeah, this is the end of part 1. I will be linking in to part 2, where I'll be joined by Mark again and ophthalmologist Dr. J. But yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello everyone, and this is part 2 of episode 3 of the VICTA Parent Voice. And part 2 is Dr. J, who is an ophthalmologist, and Mark Chapman is joining us again. I'm going to bring Dr. J in now, who's going to give us a very nice introduction about himself and the work that he does in the visual impairment community.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. So you're right, I'm Dr. J. So I'm a paediatric eye doctor from Southampton. I'm also head of paediatric ophthalmology for the Royal College. So that's kind of our governing body for eye doctor people. And I'm also a researcher, so I spend half my week doing research into usually rare genetic eye diseases. So I have lots and lots of patients that I see, and also patients I work with through research who are visually impaired, usually from quite a young age, but with a pretty wide variety of conditions.
And you do some work with the Albinism Fellowship. Would you like to tell people a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So we do quite a lot of what we call PPIE, so patient-public involvement and engagement, and some of that is doing videos. So I do a lot of videos with my friend Christina from the Albinism Fellowship online, really to challenge some of the nonsense that's out there. So it's fairly easy for people to go online and look up their condition or thoughts about their condition and find a whole load of stuff which is either frankly incorrect or just really skewed or misdirected. About 2 years ago, we decided to try and correct that to some degree for albinism by putting out some good information and discuss topics that people may not get to discuss at other times. So some of the stuff we cover is, in fact, about early diagnosis and that doctor-patient interaction, because all of the videos are me and Christina. Christina is a person living with albinism and also a daughter with albinism. So it's that kind of interaction. We talk about lots of things from both sides, but also we try and cover myths. So we call ourselves the Albinism Mythbusters, for want of a better name. But it's all just part of that idea that actually getting good information out there and support for parents, particularly in the media age, is really doable, but also something we should be doing. So it kind of is in tune with what you're doing here, Charlotte.
Okay, that's amazing. So I know some of our listeners will have children with albinism, so I'll be sure to link Dr. J's social media pages. So me and Dr. J had worked together previously on a workshop that was called Ask the Ophthalmologist, which was a very popular parent workshop, and I was in awe of how Jay fielded many questions from lots of parents with children with a vast range of eye conditions, because sometimes as parents, we just are told by an ophthalmologist there is a sight condition, and then we are sent on our way. And it's a very clinical exchange. They're there to, tell you the medical information. And I think as parents, we find that quite tricky to deal with. And we think, there must be more. There must be something else that happens after this. And then there's some visual tests that are performed. And obviously, Dr. J works with a lot of very young patients. So this is going to bring me to you now, Jay. You must get a lot of parents who are like, but how much can they see? And can this be fixed? And that must be incredibly difficult to hear, because we're very upset, frightened parents. And how do you best respond to those types of questions?
Yeah, it's really difficult. As you say, I think as a clinician, so the doctor person sitting there trying to give this information, there's so many things that you are trying to balance, and the honest truth is we don't always get it right. And I've been doing this for 25 years, so I see things get wrong, quite badly wrong sometimes, and I see things done brilliantly and everything in between. And I think those things that we're trying to balance is obviously the human side of being very acutely aware that you're not giving fabulous information at that time. You're telling people something they don't want to hear. They don't want it to be true. But you've also got to balance that, particularly when kids are young, with the inherent unpredictability of it. So it's actually very, very hard to say this is what your child will see at this age, and this age for any condition, let alone the degenerative ones, so the ones that get worse, mainly because the ones that get worse often do that on very different timescales. So it's a really, it's a difficult thing because parents want certainty often. They want clarity, totally understandably, but the information we have is obviously often not that certain or clear. So what I mean by that is that sometimes doctors, I've definitely seen this happen, doctors make the mistake of being a bit too definitive about things. So if the textbook says in this condition by this age, the vision will be this, they take that a bit too much as read because when there's such variety out there, that's a dangerous game to go down. The other difficulty we have is that often things run in families. So there's precedent in the family. And that can be helpful for the family to know that, or it can be unhelpful because running in families, conditions that people have that are exactly the same condition, because it's genetic, can be hugely variable. And that's hard for people to get their heads around. So the usual, one of the stop lines we use is just because Uncle's Johnny's vision was this at 30, it doesn't mean that your daughter's vision will be that at 30 or whatever. But that's quite a hard concept for people to get their heads around. I think the other, I suppose there's so many issues wrapped up in this, but the other one is talking about vision is quite difficult because vision is a complex thing. So when most parents ask what will their vision be or what is it now, they almost want a percentage. So you think of normal vision being 100% and therefore will it be 50, will it be half as good, etc. But the problem is it's so much more nuanced than that because lots of people think about reading the chart at the end of the room and you can talk in terms of that with all those unpredictabilities I mentioned already. But the problem with that is that we don't all walk around looking at monochrome black letters on a board. We have to deal with moving targets, coloured targets, different lighting, etc., etc. So vision is way more complex than a single measure. And then the final bit is that children, when they're born, normal, non-visually impaired, completely normally developing baby, when they're born, their vision is not good. And it gradually gets better. And visual development continues up until 5 quite rapidly, and even after that to some degree as well. So you've got to factor that in when you're talking about what do they see or what will they see.
Yeah, no, I completely understand that. When I started the blog about Scarlett's life when she was 3 years old, I wrote in depth about optic nerve hypoplasia, and I
Yeah.
met a few parents at various events, and one mum was like, "Oh, I read your blog, and I read it all religiously because my child had that." She said, "But he's actually got quite a lot of useful vision now." And I thought, well, that's quite strange because Scarlett's is kind of 0 and has stayed at 0. So I think that's important for parents to understand that things can change, sometimes for the better, and sometimes for the worst. And yeah, it's definitely that. You're being thrust into a future that you didn't plan for at all, and you think the doctor's result could be the one thing that is definitive, and it isn't as simple as that. So thank you for explaining it
Yeah.
in a bit more depth
Yeah.
about.
Just to add to that, Charlotte, the other thing, of course, is that having a condition is like a label. And I think we all want to have sort of binary things, right? Optic nerve hyperplasia, as an example, is a diagnosis. It's a thing. You can read about it. But you can have optic nerve hyperplasia where you essentially have no broadband cables to your eyes. So your vision is always going to be very, very poor. Or you can have really subtle optic nerve hyperplasia where the broadband is just a bit reduced. And we might diagnose that when kids are, 12, 13, 14, because they're just struggling a little bit with tiny print at school. So there's huge variety. And I think people do struggle with that a little bit because one child's got a diagnosis of the same name. There's huge variety. And the problem with medicine nowadays, the good thing and the bad thing, is that we're much better able to diagnose things and pick things up and give them labels, often through genetics, but it means that variety is getting even broader. So we talk a bit about this on the Mythbusters channel about tribe and ownership. It gets quite deep quite quickly, but if you consider your tribe other people with the same condition as you, because they might have similar life experiences, the problem is within that condition there is massive variety of your actual life experience because there's massive variety of the condition. So it's a complex thing, and it's really hard, I think, because people want a singular binary, that's what I've got. If I find anything about anyone else who's had that same thing, that will be the same for me. And it's often not true, sadly.
No, I completely agree with that. I think at first, when the children are quite young, like a lot of the early years parents events that I host, everyone is trying to connect with a parent of a child with the same condition because we feel like it's going to give us some form of roadmap. about what's
Yeah.
going to happen, and all the Facebook groups we join are parents of children of this, or and that's what we try to find our tribe. And I think what's quite normal is, as the child grows older, we just connect with parents of other visually impaired children, and we just put it into this really
Mm.
large blanket. We don't just go to albinism events. We go to ones of just visually impaired children, and I think that can be quite useful because, like you say, one 13-year-old optic nerve hypoplasia child isn't going to look the same as the other one. And I really like your description of the wiring. I think I would have found that description quite helpful at my
Yeah.
point of diagnosis, because it was actually, a bit of a blur back
Yeah.
then. I wasn't connected with an ECLO at the point of diagnosis. So I'm going to bring Mark in now just to ask you, you get parents at various ages, and you spoke in depth in part 1 about the services you're offering and the events and getting people together. What are some common things that you find in these very early diagnosis patients that are referred over to you?
I thought Dr. J's just spoken brilliantly, and how great he sounds. So I didn't think you were going to come to me at all. It's just exactly the way he spoke. He's just how I'd like, and not that our ophthalmologist here isn't as good. So just to say, I think there's a lot of shock. Obviously, I think there is that thirst for knowledge and a definitive thing. So part of my role here really is to talk to people and explain more, even if it hasn't really gone in, how unclear we can be at such an early age and at the first point of diagnosis, what the future may hold, because people always want to know that. They want to know, will they be able to drive? Will they be able to do this? Will they be able to do that? Having the conversation that we maybe just don't know is quite challenging, but that's the kind of area that I have a bit more time for. I mean, I don't know how much most ophthalmologists have and consultants have with parents, but I think we tend to be blessed with a bit more time. So we can spend a bit more time kind of delving into these kind of things. And then always, just to say, I never give any kind of medical advice because Dr. J, again, sorry, I sound like him in his fan club, but you will obviously you will know a million times more about the eye than I ever will. My experience of working with visually impaired people is almost as long as yours. I've been 23 years doing this kind of role, and I still don't know much about the eye, but that's not my role. My role is about the practical things that are out there to help families and children, and the emotional impact, and hopefully offering some support that way. If I can ask Dr. J a question, I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, you can ask
but
Dr.
can I
J a
ask Dr. J
question.
a question?
Yeah, brilliant.
Oh, we're breaking all the rules. I just wondered how much while you were training, and how much is spent on giving that kind of diagnosis and news. And did you pick more things up as you went along, or is there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So just before I answer that specifically, I would say that I totally agree with your assessment of ECLOs. So my experience of ECLOs is they are fantastic, and it's not just that you have extra time. You're being very modest there. It's that you are experts in what you do, and we are not. And actually, at that point that we talked about a minute ago, Charlotte, on the whole, parents are less interested in me describing a cone versus a rod or some sort of receptor in the back of the eye, and they want to know about how to deal with things. What's the future? Where do I get support? All that stuff. So they're far more interested in what Mark has to offer than what I have to offer at that point. And rightly so, because it's about practicalities and about the real world, isn't it? So yeah, ECLO's hugely important. So sorry, to answer that question specifically though, Mark, we do. So during medical school, people get trained in giving bad news, delivering bad news. It's usually a module, or pops up at various points during medical school, but that's rather generic, and it tends to focus on bad news, kind of life-ending stuff. That I don't remember having any training for very young children delivering bad news about essentially disability or whatever. Over time, you do learn to get better at it. I hope. I like to think, but we are absolutely not experts, and you could argue we should have more training in that sort of stuff. Because as you alluded to, quite often we're delivering this stuff in a super busy clinic with 16 other patients knocking around. I might be thinking, in the back of my mind, I've got to run to theatre in half an hour. That kid's going to sleep now. I need to actually get to them. Whatever. So the timing is absolutely not as anyone would design it, as a situation to deliver some not great news. I personally would say I've learned quite a lot. I do a lot of genomics. So I do a combined clinic, for example, with our professor of genomics, and they're very used to dealing with things which are, genomics provides information before you know that information otherwise, if you know what I mean. So actually it's quite useful for learning about giving diagnoses of things that might be coming. And I've found them incredibly useful. And I think one of the really useful things that they've taught me over the years is that good information at the start is not all the information necessarily. And it's not about holding things back. It's not about not telling people the truth, etc., etc. It's about, in that moment, which are the most important things to describe and how to deliver that information. And I think I've learnt a bit from them over the years. I'm sure I'm not an expert at it, and I'm sure I get it wrong on a regular basis. But I think for most eye doctors giving sort of the level of news that we're talking about just now, you'd like to think that would on the whole be the more senior eye doctors in those clinics rather than a junior doctor who's knocking through. But I'm sure, again, that doesn't always happen.
Fascinated by you saying about how much info, because I have something occasionally where I'll talk to parents about the things that are available to help, a registered child or a visually impaired child. Occasionally I'll say to them, I have kind of booklets around, like the RNIB do a nice booklet about, it's meant for adults really, but it's kind of list of things that are available to help adults. And occasionally I'll get a parent when I just get an idea that they might want a bit more information. And I'll say, even though this isn't relevant because this is a child, I wonder if you'd be interested in knowing about what's out there for adults to see what the future might hold. And occasionally people just don't want to know, and that's totally understandable. But occasionally people want to know everything. So even though their child might be 7, I'll show them a piece of free app that can read text, just so that they know that 5 years ago, this kind of technology was rubbish and it would not work very well. I'd get it out to show people and it wouldn't work properly. Nowadays, it's absolutely amazing and it works every time. It can read posters, it can read letters, and just occasionally, not to every parent, but sometimes there's that thing where I think people get some benefit of knowing that there's this help out there, and what will it be like in 5 or 10 years when their child is ready for it. But it's about shaping to the parent. So I guess you have that with, I have never given a diagnosis before or anything medical, but I imagine that there are some people that just want to know the facts.
Totally.
Let me know, doc, kind of thing.
Yeah,
Whereas
totally.
others,
full disclaimer, Charlotte was diagnosed at 4 months. I think by the time she was 5 months, I knew every school with a VI base, every specialist school. And I think I picked out Loughborough University. And then obviously all them plans and all that energy that I ploughed into research, her complex needs presented as she got older. So all them plans and everything that I'd put into place. But there is some, we find our early years take up on VICTA events is quite small considering the number of children that are receiving diagnosis. And I think some parents are, they're there for it within a few months of the child being born or finding out the news. But then we do get a lot that are coming through to us at kind of age 10. And I think the parents are a little bit, maybe have reached the acceptance stage of the process that we go through. So everyone's journey is incredibly unique. And, it's the same in the doctor office. It's the same, like, as you said, Mark, when you're meeting them via the RNIB or one of the events that you're hosting. So the information can't be very certain. So it's hard to advise around it because everything's so different. But that was very useful. This question is to both of you guys. For the first 24 hours after diagnosis, what would you give the best advice for parents? What should they be focusing on at that moment in time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's one that I'd, if Mark was working in my department, I'd probably go and ask him, to be honest.
Bless you.
I think from a pragmatic point of view, I don't generally tell people what to do in that instance. I don't think anyone's ever asked me what should we do for the next few days. I think what we try and do is provide sort of broad information, connect with ECLO, connect with orthoptist who works in our department and liaises with VI, and kind of judge it on them. It's so variable, and again, it goes back to what Mark was speaking about flexing it around what the patient and family want, and they're hugely variable. So, for example, we have families where the same condition runs through, and the families are unbelievably laid back about the diagnosis, even though it might be quite a significant one for vision. because they've experienced it before, they know what it is, and they're almost reluctant to sort of do anything. And we have to persuade them to do things to help and support their child because they might need some extra stuff. And then we have the absolute opposite, the absolute other extreme. And I think the other extreme would be the ones that worry me the most. So I suppose it is a reflective, certainly first 24 hours. I would perhaps caution people about going down a deep wormhole of individual research on the internet. I don't tell people not to use the internet because that's the most ridiculous thing to say in the world, right? But I say just, pitfalls to avoid are going down that. I often warn people that everything that you find about the condition that we might have mentioned is not going to be relevant to your child. And we've got a long road ahead of us, but we're here, slow catchy monkey, that kind of stuff. And I suppose I tend to maybe be a bit more opinionated for people I worry are going to go a bit bananas in that first 24 hours. But there aren't a huge number of them, I would say. But that's my Mickey Mouse answer. Hopefully Mark will have a grown-up answer.
Over to you, Mark.
Have you met me? No. It is a big question. And I think it relates back to something we talked about before. And with everyone being so different, some of the things that came into my head when Dr. J was just answering was, again, to talk about how people are different. And yes, we've had people been to see our consultant here and been diagnosed, and it's just been, oh, yeah, we knew, or we expected that, or, yeah, they've been offered to be registered. Great, yeah, we need that help, so brilliant. And then other times people resist it or kind of are not quite ready. But, we spoke about that kind of loss and grief thing last time, and I think there's a lot of that goes on, and it can feel like being kicked in the face or the stomach, or pick your area for people. And again, not everyone. We have people that are actually delighted to have it noted and to actually know what's going on. But more often than that, I think you do get quite a shock. And then it's a case of a bit like relationships, that when you get that kind of diagnosis, it can feel like things have changed for what you thought the future would be. Things are changed for what you thought now was going to be. And there is a kind of that whole grief thing. Again, we talked about it the other day about all that denial and maybe anger I'm very lucky to say no one's ever been angry with me that I can remember, but they've been angry with the universe or with whatever. Sometimes if they haven't been seen quickly enough, they can be angry with us. But more often than not, it's just kind of angry with everything, because this isn't what they planned for their child. What to do in the first day? I haven't really got any advice, but a note I made last time, so you've really thrown the ball at me to hit. What I wanted to say is, this might sound a bit woolly, but somebody years ago once said, what would you say to someone in the midst of something really terrible? And they said, I wouldn't tell them anything, but I'd listen. And that's our role. As an ECLO, that's our role. And again, that in the cold light of day, that may sound a bit woolly and, all right, you listen, okay. But actually, that means getting alongside somebody and kind of trying to understand how they feel and empathise and things like that. And that can have a huge effect. So the advice is obviously really important from my perspective. By the time I've spoken to someone, I may have had my consultant say, right, this is child A, and the site is this poor, they've been diagnosed, they can be registered. So I kind of already have lots of facts in my head of where I can go with the parent to talk about. But then it's up to them what we do, how long things take. Occasionally we dive straight in there and then. Sometimes people want to go home and talk on the phone or come back. I've had Teams meetings where we've talked about what registration means and certification. And sometimes people want to go and think about it, or I'll put a little note in my diary. Would you like me to ring you in a week or a month? Or so every parent is kind of different. So for that first day, I don't know that I'd advise very much. Just hug everyone in the family, really.
So I told you he'd give a more grown-up answer than me.
Grown up. I'm saying about hugging. It's very woolly, but then that's my job,
not at all.
really.
But I think what you're describing is a really important point, and a classic criticism of doctors like me is that we're kind of trained and it's drilled into us to be fixers, right? So we we see or hear a problem, and our immediate reaction is to try and come up with a solution. Like you rightly said, often the right thing to do is actually not come up with a, we'll do this then, not come up with a solution or an answer, actually just to listen, because that is much more of a process. And that's something that I don't think traditionally we are brilliant at. So yeah, we hear that a lot. And I suppose on that lines, the other thing I was thinking about, what I might advise parents, again, at risk of sounding like I'm coming up with a solution rather than listening,
No.
is to kind of write down questions, because I think it can become befuddling when you have so many questions spinning around in your head and you can't even remember the one you had 5 minutes ago. And I ask people to write them down or keep them on their phone or whatever, and then we'll often have a teleconsult or an actual consultation. And at least people feel like, right, I've got all my things on here. Once I know the answers to those, at least I've got the most out of that person that I've got for that period of time. So that would be one piece of advice. But the other piece of advice is not to give out too many pieces of advice.
I'm really glad you mentioned fixing there, and, doctors are naturally fixers. Parents, I was one of those ones that was like, right, we're gonna fix her. And I don't know, the timing of it happened. A young girl with optic nerve hypoplasia was featured on, I don't know what it would have been called then, like GMTV, one of the morning breakfast shows. And she'd gone out to and had the experimental stem cell treatment. And I thought, right, that's it. That's where we're going with this now. I obviously did a lot more research and looked at the financial implications of it, and there was nothing to say that all these children would pop up with brain tumours in 10 years' time after having this. So I think fixing is some parents' natural way to respond. Now, how do you deal with the ones that are kind of in denial and feel like they can fix it? Because you must have to kind of remind them that, this thing isn't going to, whatever's happening with their child isn't going to go away. And how do you manage that response and that expectation, I suppose?
Yeah. I mean, it is difficult, and there's absolutely a spectrum, like we were saying a minute ago, of people. So some are really extreme at one end of that and some extreme at the other, but most people are somewhere in the middle. Most parents would naturally think, well, is there something I can seek to help my child that I haven't heard about from this person? And that's a totally reasonable response. I think dealing with it, I mean, that's such a big question because it depends on the individual situation and stuff. But I think in general terms, what I try to do is reassure people that if there is a treatment that we know works and is a good idea, I will hear about it. And the same for clinical trials. And often I think what people mistake in clinical trials is a clinical trial is testing to see whether something works on the whole. It's not an established treatment by definition. So often you hear about people trying to get somebody on a clinical trial, trying to get them on this. That does happen, but a lot of clinical trials are literally trying to find out whether this thing even does anything. So there is a bit of a misconception about clinical trials. I think the reassurance, if people can believe and trust you, that you will know about these things should they become available and be trustworthy and reproducible, I will know about it, I think can be quite reassuring, particularly for people with rare genetic conditions, which I see a lot, because there's certain reasons why we do hear about those a lot. So I give the example often to parents that if someone comes up with a trial somewhere, they will basically advertise this trial. We'll look down our database. If the gene matches, we'll literally have your info, and you might just get a random letter or phone call from me in 1 to 3 to 5 years. And I think people find that a bit reassuring. It feels a bit like somebody's looking for stuff for you. I think from the people who are extreme fixers and are looking for crazy things that somebody's put in a newspaper somewhere across the world, and sometimes that does need managing a little bit. In terms of expectation, but people aren't crazy, right? They're doing what parents do, which is try and do the best they can for their children. So sometimes we need to help them with that exploration a little bit. But I think one of the main things for me is making parents feel like they're not the only advocate for their child, because it can feel like that a lot, can't it?
Yes.
Knowing that there's somebody who's actually, if there's something across the radar, there's something that actually will do something of use. My eye doctor is not just going to totally ignore it for 20 years, which is largely the case. So yeah, I suppose that's how we generally try and deal with that kind of thing. The other difficulty we face, of course, is that for a lot of the conditions we have, it's not just about we're not totally sure how much it will affect the eyes, which is really relevant because if you're going to have a surgical intervention or a gene injected in the back of your eye, you need to know that it works for people with that level of vision. And it's not just about trying to get a tiny bit of extra vision for somebody who sees nothing at all, if your child's actually seeing really well at that point.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. But for other conditions, we also have, it's not just about the eyes. So we're not actually sure whether neurological features will kick in time as well, in which case the relevance of these treatments might be slightly different. So it's complex.
It really is. I can remember like seeing this little girl and coming back, and then I think there was a bit of a backlash from it, and everyone was saying, the parents had raised that much money and spent that much time that they perhaps thought it was a placebo, and because it wasn't measurable, the improvement in the sight after the set, I watched it and thought, right, that's it. We're fundraising. And I feel quite guilty now to say that I felt some hope because I wouldn't change a single hair on Scarlett's head now. She's born exactly the way that she's supposed to be. I wouldn't ever want to, she doesn't have the level of comprehension to understand, but if she did and she understood conversations, I would never want her to think that I was trying to fix her because I don't think it's helpful for children to feel like they're broken with there is a solution to change her from the way that you were created. And I think I find that quite common in parents as well, that we want to fix. And, is there going to be a certain type of technology or a bionic eye or something in the future that we can explore? And I don't think it's necessarily particularly helpful for the children to perhaps hear that kind of language about, you're broken. And one day there might be something that can fix you, because that's not going to be good for self-esteem. And we have to model. If we don't accept it, how do we expect our children to accept it and, and live the life as full as they possibly can, regardless of sight condition or not?
I totally agree with that point. And I think there's lots of parents who go through a bit of an evolution, I would say. Maybe you did the same, where when your baby's really young, you're more into the fixing thing. And then as they get older and you kind of know them and that's part of who they are and what they are, you sort of become a bit more pragmatic about, well, would I change this thing? And for the young person themselves, as they get older, often that evolves. So we see this a lot in people with albinism, that when we talk about if we could do something for you to make things better, what would that be? And it's hugely variable. So for some people, if you live in sub-Saharan Africa with albinism, skin is probably the main thing you'd want to fix, for want of a better word. For a lot of people, it's about vision. Some people, it's about appearance. But lots of people in the UK say, actually, I wouldn't want my skin tone to go darker because it's who I am, and it's part of my personality. It's who I am. And in fact, my dancing eyes might not even be something I want to fix. I think individuals and parents go through an evolution with that, don't they, over time?
Definitely. Yeah, 100%. We're just going to, for want of making sure that this episode is relevant to a variety of parents across the spectrum, we're going to touch a little bit on now, like, I wish I knew a little bit more about eye conditions. So I'm thinking of children like Stargardt's, when it starts to present a little bit later in life, or perhaps has been some kind of seizure or something wrong with the brain which has caused a later in life sight loss. So I imagine some parents will be going through that now. How does that differ? What are the different challenges that you would expect with the age groups?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I suppose there's the whole load of things. Once you have children who are up and about and talking and whatever age, if you're thinking 10 onwards, whatever, there's a whole load of different factors. So one would be that our peak age for children with medically unexplained visual symptoms, in other words, things that we can't put down to a physical problem, that's about the sort of age that we see a peak in that. So that can muddy the water. And we also, obviously, it introduces the problem with kids being much more aware of it and potentially being in denial. So I see children of that age sometimes who come in and you think, well, how have you not come in earlier and reported this? And partly it's because kids just accept what's there, but partly they sort of deny and don't report sometimes. The other thing is that conditions which kick in at that age are sometimes more of a concern for us because they are slightly less likely to be something you were always going to get, if you know what I mean. And therefore it makes us worry about a whole different set of underlying causes. So people might get a bit nervous a lot quicker in terms of things that affect other parts of the body, things that might affect your brain, etc., etc. So it's a different set of conditions which triggers a different set of sort of anxieties and, I suppose, investigation routes for doctors. But then for families, it's often something which is sort of slowly crept up on the whole, unless it's a big injury or they've had a an event, a neurological event or something,
Yeah.
then it's obviously very sudden.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Beautifully answered. I'm going to hand over to Mark now for his perspective. So when you've got these, I remember dragging Scarlett and her sighted brother to every single event that I could find, probably within like 100-mile radius. If there was something on that a charity was hosting, then I was there. So when you've got these little children, you kind of tell them what to do and you take them along to these things and they play side by side and there may be not much thought going into the fact that they have a sight condition because they're just children, carved blocks who are playing. So our teens, and it's quite normal, not just with visually impaired teens, but just generally in life around the 14 to 17 age group, teenagers start to go their own way. And what's also quite pivotal at the age is, they get their independence and they start going to the cinema without mum and dad and going out to the park. And obviously our children may not be having that level of independence to go and do that. So mentally and emotionally around that age group is very difficult without a sight condition. And then that changes because their independence is going to be severely impacted as a result of it. Some teenagers are probably still going to need quite a lot of supervision. How at your events, Mark, are these young people presenting?
I think it's a huge question. I think with teenagers, the shock, if it is something new coming on during somebody's teenage years, that can be a huge shock because it's something that people weren't expecting or anything. I think for the social events and things, it's kind of sometimes disappointing from our point of view, but lovely to watch when kids outgrow us. So when teenagers outgrow the group, particularly that we do once a month, that it's mainly younger children and then they kind of grow out of us. And that's, sometimes we get sad because we don't see these wonderful kids as much or anymore. But it's wonderful that they've outgrown us because I think all those things that teenagers go through, like kicking at the world and kind of finding their space and wanting to be independent, that can be made really hard for the children, the teenagers, when they're visually impaired, doubly, trebly, quadruply so. There's a local group here in Luton that tries to run something for teenagers and they kind of find it hard to get people because sometimes people don't want to be grouped together. Like teenagers don't want to go with other visually impaired children. I keep getting mixed up between children and teenagers, and I think most teenagers would kick me for calling them a child. But during that kind of period, it can be really tricky for the teenagers to be trying new things, and parents have to be really strong to encourage them and let them, because some parents can be quite protective, as we all can, about our teenagers and children. But sometimes with the social groups, it can be hard for that middle area and knowing exactly what the right thing that they would like and trying to fulfill that from our perspective is quite challenging. But I do think they need some support and they need some help to be them as well with their vision impairment, be honest and open about how that might affect them, but then push at the world to try and do more and more and more. And I think some of the volunteers that I work alongside, not being visually impaired myself, but a lot of my co-volunteers are visually impaired and have grown up visually impaired, so they can really relate to teenagers. I think that can be quite an important step for teenagers who are visually impaired themselves to talk to adults that have maybe gone through that in a different era, because now everything is so different for teenagers.
We're coming to the end now, and I was going to ask your best piece of advice, but I asked that in part one, so I'm going to mix it up a bit. So we'll go to Mark first. People come to you with a variety of different problems. What is the overarching issue that parents come to you about? Which is the one that stands out the most, that is the most problematic?
So varied. There's a few things that have instantly come to mind, but things are so varied. It can be getting the right help at school, getting the right support. That is a real challenge for quite a lot of parents, and people sometimes deserve a medal for the fight. Some of the mums and dads that I know, I think some of the parents I know have had to fight and fight and fight to get the right position for their child and teenager, to get the right educational support, to get the right educational place. That's the thing that instantly springs to mind that people have to fight for, because I know people where things have just slotted in, and maybe that's a case of having a child who is easy to slot into place, or maybe it's a case of the local kind of authority does really well for that child. But sometimes it can really have an effect on parents having to fight all the time to try and get that kind of support. I think getting some of the other things like benefits and other things, hopefully locally, I'd like to think that comes up a lot, but I'd like to think it's not too much of a stressor because there's quite a lot of local support to get things like that and to get that kind of help, to do DLA forms or to get blue badges and things like that, or to be told what's out there. I think the education and getting that kind of right support is one of the trickiest thing that comes up, as well as understanding the diagnosis and the prognosis of where things could lead for younger children, especially. That comes up quite a lot where people are told what condition the child has, but there's a little bit of maybe when they're very young, the parents either don't understand or haven't really looked into it a huge amount because life is busy and having children anyway can just take up every single minute you have. So actually Googling or asking someone, well, what does this mean for now and for the future? X child be able to drive, do you think, later? Will this child be able to work? Will they be able to? So there's sometimes a lot of questions about what the future holds.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. You've kind of answered the best piece of advice, but we'll get a bit of a soundbitey, quotey type one off you now, Jay. We've already had don't get too many pieces of advice, but I want people to go away with like a strong message. So if there is, I know everyone's unique and you say something different to every single person, but there must be something that you say quite commonly to everyone.
Yeah. So I think in the early days, right at the start of diagnosis, I'd say take a breath. And remember, you have work ahead of you, but it is a marathon and not a sprint. You don't need to go crazy and be a crazy researcher finding all these different things around the world and challenging this and getting all the info in the first 48 hours. There will be a lot of things to do and it'll be a long road. There'll be a lot of people to support you, but it's a long road. So marathon, not a sprint.
I would have appreciated you being my ophthalmologist. So I just want to say a huge thank you for you both joining me today. Thank you for coming and chatting. And yeah, brilliant, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. It's been absolutely delightful. I come from quite a busy family, so as much as I talk quite a lot occasionally, I don't get a lot of chance to talk at home. So it's quite nice to be able to chat so much. Thank you for having me.
No, it's been perfect. Thank you very much. You take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.